CBSE Board, Class 11, History, Chapter 3, Part 7, Audio by Renee Matthew. We saw the divisions between the peasants and the serfs, and we also saw the basic meaning of the word serfs. Of course, there was a slight difference between the lives that were led by the peasants and the serfs. The word serf comes from the verb serve. Okay? So, free peasants always held their farms as tenants of the Lord. It is like staying as a guest. When you go and stay as a tenant, as a paying guest in a particular place, it was the same rules that were applicable for free peasants. They were peasants and they just had to pay a little bit of money to the Lord. So they were known as free peasants. They did not have any other bond to the Lord. The men always had to give military services. They had to offer military services. At least 40 days every year, they had to go for military warfare. Of course, we saw that the peasants were amateur when it comes to military services, but still they had to serve. The peasant families had to set little bit of their days of the week. They had to set aside certain days of the week, especially 3 or more than 3 days, where they will go to the Lord's estate and work there. So more than 3 days they had to go to the Lord's estate and work for the Lord. The other days they had to work in the Lord's field. That is the usual field work and labor. The output from such labor called labor rent. It is like paying rent for staying in the accommodation which was provided by the Lord. Either they had to pay by money or they had to give labor rent, would go directly to the Lord. It is like the Lord will ask them to work for 3 days or more than 3 days to show that they are giving labor rent. So that went as rent to the Lord. So all the privilege was for the Lord actually. And they were also required to do unpaid labor services which were not actually paid, like extra services. So you shouldn't have a wrong notion that they just had to work on the field and they will get their wages. Indirectly also their lives were actually tuned and dominated by these lords. They had to dig ditches, gather firewood, build fences and repair roads and buildings. So all the in and out services they had to do to make sure and ensure that the lords were really happy with their luxurious life. Okay. So these are the things which did not even come inside their endowment sometimes. That was the kind of rule that they had. So beside helping in the fields, we saw that women and children also helped in the field. They had to do other tasks like spun thread, wove cloth, make candles, press grapes. That was usually done by the children to prepare wine for the Lord's use. And none of these things can be actually possessed by the women and children. They just had to give all of their labor to the Lord's use. There was another kind of tax which was collected by the state, and the name of that tax is tail. Tithe, T-I-T-H-E, is the tax which they pay to the church. Don't confuse tail with tithe. Tithe is giving tenth of your harvest or produce to the church. Tenth of whatever you get. Tail is a tax which was directly imposed by the kings on the peasants. The clergy and nobles were exempted from paying this. They were not even asked to pay this. Tail had to be paid by the peasants alone. The serfs were required to cultivate plots of land, but these belonged to the Lord. None of the serfs had any authority over the land. And much of the produce, almost all the produce was given to the Lord. It had to be given to the Lord. Nothing could be possessed by the serfs. And most of the work was actually exclusively done for the Lord, not for anybody else. They did not receive any wages and they could not leave the estate without the Lord's permission. They couldn't run away. They did not receive any money and they cannot express their displeasure or their discontent to the lords. They did not have such kind of authority. Now it is like you have got labor unions where they will express all their problems, right? In those days, nothing was there. They couldn't even move out of the place. The Lord always claimed a number of monopolies at the expense of his serfs. A lot of trade was also done on behalf of the serfs. Now, serfs could use their lord's mill. I told you that the manorial estate always had a mill, it had a church, it had so many basic necessities. The serfs were allowed to use the lord's mill to grind their flour, and also his oven to bake their bread, and his wine presses to distill wine and beer. So everything, all the equipments belonged to the Lord. They had to use all these things to meet their daily expenses also. And the Lord also had, apart from all these dominion, the Lord always decided whom the serf should marry. So look at the social and personal life control that they had over the serfs. Even the personal life was controlled. Or who might give his blessing to the serf's choice. So it's like sometimes the Lord will ask the serf to marry one particular person, or sometimes they will allow the serf to marry on their choice, but on payment of a fee. If they pay a particular amount as fee, they will be allowed to marry according to their choice, and that was like a blessing. Of course, you can marry according to your choice, but that was like a blessing for the serf. Now we have to again see what was happening in England. Okay, so feudalism developed in England from 11th century. Earlier we saw what happened in France and England. That was only an introduction. So when did it start developing exactly? It came from France when Normandy, the ruler from Normandy, came and annexed England. The Angles and Saxons came from Central Europe. They started settling in England in the 6th century. They were like primitive tribal people, but very strong people. And the country's name, England, is a variant of Anglo-land. So from this word, Anglo-land, this word was developed. So we saw that they got this particular name, or they got this feudalism, the idea of feudalism, from a Duke of Normandy, from France. So in the 11th century, what happened is, the Duke of Normandy, his name was William, he crossed the English Channel with an army, very powerful Duke from France, defeated the Saxon king of England. You should remember that the Angles and Saxons were small, like they were small kingdoms. They were very small in number. So this particular ruler, the Duke, was possessed with very good military power. They were actually equipped. Militarily, they were equipped. So they crossed the English Channel with a very huge army and defeated easily the Saxon king of England and his troop. So the first time France and England were often at war. From this time onwards, their relationship between England and France was not very good. They did not have cordial relationship. They were often at war because of disputes over territory and trade. Constantly they used to fight for the territory and also their trade properties. Okay. So how did William actually cross the English Channel? How was he successfully able to defeat the Saxon king of England? In those days, it is not very easy to have a map in your hand. But William I was very clever to have a land mapped. And that was distributed in sections to 180 Norman nobles. Okay, he made a map with all the difficulty, and that was distributed to 180 of his Norman nobles, and they migrated with him. They crossed the English Channel with him. Did you understand? So it's because of the map primarily. These nobles, they became the chief tenants of the king, and they were expected to give military help also. Okay, because the king is giving a lot of things to the lords will give back military help. And they were forced, they were obliged to supply a certain number of knights to the king. So much of responsibility was there for the chief tenants to provide knights, to maintain the knights and all that, to safeguard the territory. Of course, the fight or the conquest, the rivalry was based on the trade and also on territory. You can see that here. So chief tenants of the king, like how they were indirectly connected to the knights. The knights were owned by the nobles, and under all of these came the peasants and the serfs. So what happened is, when the knights were very chivalrous when they actually proved their military skills and all that. It was like a competition for the knight to compete with one another. Because when they actually win in the battle, they were given land as gift. So some of the people actually gave land as gift to the knights who would actually serve them, and they will in turn serve the king. The knight will serve the chief will serve the king. Did you understand? So the chief will always give land as the gift. So it actually kind of encouraged the knight to go for warfare. So, of course, they were not allowed to use the knights for private warfare. They had private war disputes and all that, but they were not allowed to use the knights for private warfare, and that was forbidden in England. In other places in France, we saw it was not forbidden, right? But in England, they could not use it for private warfare. It was only at the expense of the king. You had to do everything with the permission of the king and the church. So Anglo-Saxon peasants became tenants of various levels of landholders. Because France came and annexed England, they actually conquered Anglo-Saxons, the Angles and Saxons. So what happened eventually? They were made peasants, and they became tenants at various levels of landholders. If they pacified the knight and the landowner, they will be under them. It was like that. Okay? So there were a lot of factors which affected the social and economic relationships. A lot of factors were there. And members from the first two orders, we saw that they saw the social system as a stable and unchanging system. Especially the clergy and the bishops, nothing affected them. That is why it is written as stable and unchanging. They always enjoyed. There were a lot of processes which were transforming the system. In spite of that, so many things were transforming. Every day people were attempting change. Some of these, like people could not change the social system from the first two orders. It was difficult because they were very powerful. If you attempted to touch their authority, you will be severely and harshly punished. Okay. But how did they change? How did the transformation take place? We will see eventually that England got rid of feudal system after that. Okay. But changes in environment were gradual. Because of the changes in environment, all these things were imperceptible. Okay. Many of these kind of belief that like maybe the people from the first two orders, the bishops and the clerks, everybody, the clergy and king, everybody thought nobody can touch us. But eventually, because of the changes in the environment, everything gradually changed. All the others were dramatic. It just happened quickly, like the changes in agriculture, technology and land use. The gradual change was because of the environment which nobody took notice of, but agriculture, technology, land use, everything was so dramatic that we could actually make out what was happening. Okay? And then there was a lot of change as a result of that which affected the social and economic ties between lords and vassals. See, eventually what happens, why do people actually work for others when they get some rights in return? So when that was not granted, there was a kind of problem between the economic ties between the lords and vassals. Now we have to examine these processes one by one. What were the economic ties between the lords and vassals? What happened after that? Everything we have to see one by one. The first one is the environment, which was really gradual. Okay, so from the 5th to the 10th centuries, most of Europe was covered with vast forest. It was so green and lush green, okay? Really difficult. They had so many animals. When you have so many forest animals, everything will be there. And the land was available in plenty for agriculture. Okay. But still, there was a limit for it because most of it were owned by the manors. So the land available for agriculture was actually very limited because it was under the possession of different people. So the peasants were very angry with the conditions that they lived in. They could not flee. If they fled, also it was a big problem, and they faced a lot of oppression. And what they did is they used to actually flee and take refuge in the forest. When they go and hide in the forest, it is very difficult to find them, right? That is what happened. So always the peasants, when they wanted to run away, if they ran away, what happened? The land manors will find them. So they always took refuge in the forest, which were thickly populated with trees and animals. It was dense, okay, and that is why they went there. And the manners and kings never they never had access to the forest. That is what happened in those days. The remaining we'll see in the next upcoming audio.